If old race cars could talk, the Cambridge Monaro would have one hell of a story to tell. This car was the creation of a New Zealand racer by the name of Spencer Black, or better known as Spinner Black. Spinner introduced the very first racing Camaro to New Zealand in 1968, and a year later decided to expand to a two-car team. He'd accumulated a bunch of Chevy speed equipment, but because importing cars into New Zealand back then was so difficult, rather than build a second Camaro, he opted instead for an Australian muscle car called a Holden Monaro. Cambridge Monaro was a first-generation HK model, and among its various engine options was a small block Chevy V8. It made perfect sense. Effectively, Spinner built a Camaro wrapped in a Monaro body. A blue-on-blue GTS Monaro was sourced through a Waikato General Motors agent, and Spinner's team then set about turning it into a race car in late 1969. The plan was for Spinner to keep racing the Camaro, while the Monaro would be leased to another driver by the name of Rod Coppins. But early development problems saw Coppins switch across to the Camaro, and he ultimately went on to finish first equal in the New Zealand Saloon Car Championship, tied with a Shelby Mustang of Red Dawson, which we actually featured on the channel a little while back. I'll post a link above. Meanwhile, the Monaro was sold to another colourful character by the name of Grady Thompson, who was seemingly fearless and hugely spectacular. Unfortunately, Grady only raced the Monaro for one season, and it passed through a couple of different owners before it ultimately ended up with a racer called George Bunce. George fitted the car with a really fat set of Australian-made Moya Mag wheels, and he also grafted on some rear fender flares made from cut-down Volkswagen Beetle fenders. Now this required moving the fuel filler from behind the left rear wheel to the top of the left rear quarter. And this is a really important detail which I'll get to shortly. George raced the Monaro into 1975 before he sold it, and after that it became a really rough and tough street car, still fitted with a roll cage. And then in the 1980s, it just sort of disappeared. Now this is where I play a very small role in this car's history. Now fast forward to 2012. One morning I was scrolling through a New Zealand online auction website called Trade Me, and I happened to spot a rough old HK Monaro body. To give you an idea of the shape it was in, the reserve was $1. Now looking at the photos, there are a few clues that this might have been the long lost Cambridge Monaro. The seller didn't really know what he had, but he kind of suspected that this was an old race car. It had big fender flares on the back, and the fuel filler had been relocated to the top of the rear quarter. Remember what I was saying about George Bunce? I wasn't sure if it was the actual car, but I told my good buddy John McKechnie about it. Now John first saw this car in 1969, and he was so inspired by it, it made him a lifelong racing enthusiast, and also a lifelong Holden Monaro enthusiast. But more importantly, this became his dream car. Now John wasn't sure that this was the Cambridge Monaro either, but he decided to bid on it anyway, purely to save it. You see, the other bidders only wanted it for the valuable body tags, and almost certainly the body would have been scrapped. In the end, John won the auction, and it was only when he went to collect the car that he found evidence that this was indeed the long-lost Cambridge Monaro. He then spent the next 5 years accurately restoring it right down to the very last detail. He even tracked down quite a few of the original parts, including the ultra-rare moon intake manifold and some of the original American racing magnesium wheels. So here is the beautiful Cambridge Monaro as it is today. I should point out, by the way, that I visited John shortly after he purchased the car, before the restoration began, and I saw the evidence on the body, including old hand-painted signage and orange paint from when George Bunce owned it, that proves the authenticity of this car. Now, Cambridge is a cigarette brand owned by Rothmans, I believe, and it's really a truly beautiful livery that John went to great pains to get right. And one of the best features of this car is the beautiful fender flares that were obviously long gone by the time John bought the car, but he went to great lengths once again to accurately replicate them. I'll get to this rear wing in a moment. This actually has its own story to tell. But as you can see, this car was built for Rod Coppins, who went on to win the New Zealand Saloon Car Championship in 1970 and 73. This was a blue-on-blue car, and John is a vehicle upholsterer, so he replicated the original upholstery. The Beware Dogs sticker is actually correct to the car, although I think this went on when Grady Thompson owned it. Now, this car is an HK model, first generation, but it ran the facelifted HT grille. The HT came out in 1969, but the team obviously just wanted to keep the car current. John accurately replicated the original split front bumper and the original license plate. Cars in New Zealand back then, even race cars, had to be road registered. Now, this rear wing here, this wasn't something that John just added. This was fitted to the car in period, and John went to a lot of trouble to find out the origins of it. Turns out it was actually from a South African made Chevrolet Can-Am, which was quite literally a Vauxhall Forenza fitted with a small block Chevy V8. Now, if you look around the left-hand side here, you'll see that John retrofitted the fuel filler in its correct location as this car ran in period, even though the top filler on the rear quarter was one of the details that helped identify this car. Now, back when this car was new, you could order it with a small block Chevy V8, which is why Spinner was able to run a small block Chevy in this car as a race car. And yep, in period, this car did actually run a quad set of Weber carbs. The Chevy's backed up by a Muncie M22, which is all period correct, and a Chevy 12-bolt rear end. Like I say, this is basically a Camaro in a Holden Monaro body. The main difference being that the Monaro is about 3 inches longer in the wheelbase. It's an incredible story and an amazing twist of fate that this car that so inspired John when he was just a teenager was ultimately saved by him 40 years later. Anyway, that's it for this episode, guys. Hope you enjoyed this little video. Please hit the like and subscribe button, and we will catch you next time. See ya!